let's move on with a bit more of the discovery of some of the selection tools or alpha tools. This one here is just to make us a little bit more familiar with some of the techniques, and not for a particular reason such as painting clouds or painting landscapes or foliage, but really just to practice a little bit, what's this alpha channel, how do you work with it, and where is the power with it. And what I'll do is I'll start by erasing. Let me go clear everything here. Okay, so first of all, this alpha options, as mentioned in the Steam forum, that's something you can access here. Let me first also turn off my custom brush. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the default brush settings here, or choose one of the default brushes. There you go. So the alpha panel, you can see it under the view other alpha panel, and you can also see that by right-clicking many of the selection tools. There are a few tools here that are oriented to alpha. The magic wand is one that doesn't do that, but the others, such as the lasso or the lasso to ellipse, ellipse to alpha, and the rectangle to alpha, many of these will pop up the alpha options. And it's a reminder of many of the tools that you also have in the selection menu. Right? This used to be called the alpha menu, but it really, the purpose for it is mostly to create and work with selections. But so let's see what we'll do. There are a couple of tools that are quite important. There's actually a lot of important things in here. So here's what we want to do. We want to create some sort of a image, like something like this, and then only grab a portion of it into the custom brush. So whatever that may be, right? Let's say we have some sort of a very wobbly printed circuit display here. And then maybe we'll invert this. Actually, let's go and invert. There you go. So let's say we want to grab a portion of this into the image as a custom brush. So one thing we'll do is we'll use the ellipse to alpha right here, or we can also probably, no, that's the tool, we will see it here. Yep, let's do that, and make a selection, something like this. All right. Now in my case, you see it turn pink here on the outside where it's not selected. That's because I have this option here for overlay marked. If I uncheck that, you only see the marching ants. And in fact, if I disable that, you don't see it. Right? You don't see that there is a selection, but there is a selection nonetheless. And you can verify that by going back to the painting. And if you paint here, nothing happens. But if you paint on the inside of that selection, you see that it's coming through. All right. So of course, it's always easier to know what you're doing next if you actually see the marching ants, at least, which indicates where the transition is from fully selected to not selected at all. That's the 50% mark, half selected. Easier perhaps also to know, well, is it selected on the inside or on the outside, by using this overlay coloring. You can actually configure that under the view and settings to indicate whether you want that, I forget where it is, probably over here, no, under the GUI perhaps, to indicate whether you want to invert the selection highlight. Right? So maybe you want pink to actually represent the part that is selected. I usually work the other way, so I say invert selection highlight color, so it's turning pink when it's not selected. Now this is a very crisp transition on that selection. Right? You can zoom here. I'm using the Control Shift keys and right click or drag to zoom in. You can see it's a very crisp transition. What I'd like to do is blur it. So there's a couple of blur options, like a box filter or the blur alpha, which you also see here under the selection menu. And let's say we use the blur selection, that's the alpha blur, and now you can see that it's doing a bit of a blur. In fact, before I do that, let me store. You have a store alpha. There you go. It's the same, of course, here under store selection. Right? So this is a very crisp transition. And one thing you can do in this actually is paint right in it. You just need to go over here and say you want, or maybe blur it. Right? You can do some painting right in there, and affect this blur transition. But it's doing this modification inside, or paint on it even. It's doing that inside this stored copy. It's not applying that to this here. If you want to get this thing into the current alpha, you just replace, right? Now it put that alpha right in there. All right, so let's go and instead undo and go back to this and store it. Let's keep a stored saved copy of that, and simply use the blur alpha, or maybe this time we'll use the box. There you go. You can actually show the alpha in that case too, so that's sometimes really handy. All right, so we have the alpha selection on there with the blurriness to it, but we'd like to position it a little bit at a slightly different location. So you can simply use the control key now and drag this around. Right, that's the same thing here. You have this little hand icon that allows you to move the alpha around, and of course it wraps around if you go too far. But that allows you to position it over the parts that you really want to pick up. And then the question is, of course, well, how do you pick this thing up? Well, you have two ways here. You can either use this tool here, the custom brush selector tool, right? And with that, you just need to give it enough margin. Don't come too close to this, right? I mean, we see the marching ants here, but we know it's going a little bit beyond that because we blurred it. So the question then is, well, how far do we go? And that's where it's a little bit tricky. But you could go something like this and probably caught it all, right? And then you go store and manage copy, and that's in the brush now, and you can see the plaid pattern. Now that's one way to do it. Another way that's perhaps a surefire way is basically to just use the use selected as brush. It will pick up this selection, and it will automatically find the tightest narrow bounding box, right? And boom, it took it. Now it also cleared it, but you may be able to show it again. Not the selection is gone, but the brush picked it up, right? And plus you can also undo, and it comes back to the prior state. So the alpha channel is restored if you need it. Plus you have it now stored in the brush with that selection. And so now if you clear this, let's go clear selection. Now you can paint with that, right? And of course I have all sorts of settings on my brush, such as using over here, using the rotation. Your tablet pressure might also affect the opacity or the size or the angle. There's all sorts of additional controls for the brush. But anyway, that's a quick intro to or a recap, perhaps, for some of us to working with the selections to make it part of the brush eventually, and then paint with that. All right, so hopefully that works, and that gives you some insight and motivation to learn a little bit more about working with alpha. That's really what this tutorial and a whole series of tutorials is about, is to learn how to visualize or how to work with the selection mask as a way to create a variety of other images. For instance, here, let's say we need this to be a little bit smaller. You know, you have a grow alpha and a shrink alpha, right? So if you make smaller, if you size to shrink, this is how many pixels, right? So it goes in by 1 pixel or out, and so 16, it will make it that much smaller. Grow alpha the other way around, like this. So sometimes you just need to have it go up by one little bit, and that's the way to do it. There's also a scale alpha, and with the scale alpha, actually, let me see, I haven't used that. Oh, there is a transform alpha. Maybe that's the one I really want to use. Yeah, so that's to transform, but also to scale it and even to rotate it. So there's a bunch of transform options that you can apply to the selection in the alpha channel. There's an adjust and a dynamic range. Now that's important too, especially the dynamic range. Now if we did this very clear, crisp alpha, there's not much more to expand in the dynamic range, right? So if we did something like this here with a rectangle selection, it's probably alpha value 0 on the outside and alpha value 1 or white on the inside. And if we get the alpha here, you see it, the rectangular selection. But if we had actually painted the selection, let's say we get an airbrush and we make it, so let's clear the alpha, clear selection, and we make the airbrush very light, opacity very low. So as we paint here, it's very light. But we do this in the alpha, so you can actually paint on alpha. You can go here to the selection menu and say paint on selection. Right, so you now see the current, initially the selection, everything is selected, but as you paint on it, it's got some parts that are almost black, but not fully black, and you know, maybe we need to expand the dynamic range, so the darkest part actually are black. So let's say we have something like this. We know that none of these are fully black, right? So let's go end the selection. Down here you see a little icon to end the painting on alpha. So there are some parts that are 50% on the alpha channel. That's why we see the marching ants. But for the most part, it's only very light. And what you might want to do is actually pronounce it a little bit more, expand the dynamic range, so the darkest value on the selection becomes even darker, right, all the way to black, and that would be basically on the outside. So we can do expand dynamic range, so now you have a much more pronounced presence, and you can select, you can store that, and you can see here now that it's a little bit more intense, and you have some parts that are actually black in there. Alright, so that's the expand dynamic range, but sometimes that's still not enough, and so what you can do is you can adjust alpha. Same thing here from the selection, expand dynamic range and then adjust selection. So with adjusting the selection, this is very similar to the filter we have here for the RGB channel, right? Adjust value, you have value, brightness, contrast, and gamma, right? That changes the coloration or the brightness, the brightness, the value, all these things here. I'm going to do that now on the alpha channel, right? It's a grayscale 8-bit value in the alpha channel. I can do the same thing here, adjust selection, and so you can make the selection go brighter. You can adjust the brightness like this. You can go to higher contrast, tighten it or widen it, and sometimes that's the tools you want to make that transition of what is selected and what is not selected a little bit crisper, right? So you use the contrast or you use the gamma to adjust those. And so that's another part of working with alpha. Grow alpha box, the blurring, transform. Let's go back to this. Now we can also rotate that. Right? So there's a variety of techniques that you might see, and then of course what we do with the alpha, well, there's a couple of different things. Sometimes you want that to be the transparency or the opacity, but there's other things to do too. You might want to use it to cast sort of a glow, right? If you use, let's say I erase to black and then I want to add some sort of a glow around it, I can alpha glow. Now this one, I think it did, basically it takes the primary color, so I need to switch here and do that again. Glow alpha, alpha glow, something like this. So now you have this glow, and if you change the color, left click on yellow or on blue for instance, and you do alpha glow that way, you get kind of a bluish tint on that, right? So that's another thing. Sometimes you use the alpha also for a drop shadow, right? So let me go and erase to white, right click here, and then I want a drop shadow. You can give it a bit fuzziness, opacity, maybe a bit more on the offset. Oop, that's too much. Something like this. And there you go. Now it might be on the inside, instead we need it on the outside. So let's do that again and invert it. And now you see the drop shadow here. See that? Okay, so that's another use of the alpha channel. And then there is also emboss. Give it a bit of a 3D emboss look, and you can see sort of a lighting effect to that. Clear the alpha afterwards, and so that's something you use sometimes for text, right? You erase to white, you draw some text, and something like this, make it a bit more readable. There you go. Perhaps a little bit wider on that box so we see the exclamation mark, we see the entire text, and then click outside to start moving it. And let's say you want to put it right there and put that into alpha. So the text, instead of drawing it into like the colors, you can also have it go to alpha. You can there click as alpha and apply text. So now you have the text in here. And from there you can take it into a couple of places. You can first of all store it or grab it here into the stored copy here, get alpha. You have a stored copy here now, and sometimes you use that to let's say make a selection that is along the edges only, right? So you don't want this entire thing on the inside selected, you just want a small narrow band going along that edge. And one way to do that is to shrink it and then subtract it from the stored copy, or grow it and subtract it, right? Do a difference between one bigger image and one smaller image. So let's say, for instance, we make this a little bit bigger. Let's go selection, grow, and make it bigger by about 3 or 4 pixels. There you go. And store that. Selection, store, just so we have a way to compare the two. So we have this one here, that's the bigger, and this one is the smaller version. Right? And what we want to do is have this one and then subtract this guy from it. Right? So we can replace, so that's the one that was already in there, no difference now, but we can then subtract this stored copy. So click on subtract, and you can see how the inner part is now subtracted and therefore is going back to the non-selected state. As a result, we now have the alpha channel just on those, along the edge of those of that text. And so that's something that you can use for a variety of effects. You know, you could for instance fill this with a gradient. Right? You go to the fill tool. Well, first of all, let's go and selection store, because we may want to go back to that. So let's have a safe copy. Let's say we want to fill this with a gradient. One way to do that is actually just with the linear gradient tool right here, linear gradient, and select a gradient, like something like this sunset color here, and go from one to the other, and you see it will fill only inside the selection. Right? Okay, so something like that. And then maybe you also have to do something like a drop shadow. So now here comes that drop shadow. Make sure you test it. Okay, invert is good, but it's too much off now. So let's go back to maybe 8. There you go. Test it. There you go. Then we maybe want to also add a little bit of emboss by alpha and give it just a tiny little bit there. There you go. All right. Clear the selection. And so here we go. We have now a very different text. And that's really what this is all about. Is by working with alpha, you have all sorts of additional things you can do. And hopefully you'll be able to explore some and make some magic happen. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned. We'll be working more on transparencies and selections and masks, which really is all working with the alpha channel. All right, thanks for watching.